The galaxy had many names for the people of Vetha Prime, but the most common name was the Silent Ones. And everyone who heard this name understood exactly what it meant. The Velith were tall and thin, with bodies that seemed to bend like young trees in the wind, and their skin was almost see-through, showing the soft glow of light that moved beneath it like rivers of color. They had no voices, no vocal cords, no way to scream or shout or cry out in pain. And so they spoke with light instead, their limbs pulsing with blues and greens and golds that told stories, more beautiful than any spoken word. But the galaxy did not care about beauty, and it did not care about peace, and it certainly did not care about a species that had never learned to fight for 3,000 years. The Velith had been slaves. They had been passed from empire to empire like objects, bought and sold and traded between the powerful species, who saw them as nothing more than tools with legs they were smart enough to operate, complex machines and gentle enough to care for children and quiet enough to never cause trouble. And these qualities made them perfect servants in the eyes of their masters. The Cathari Dominion currently held control of Vetha Prime, and they were the worst masters the Silent Ones had ever known. The Cathari were massive reptilian creatures with scales, the color of dried blood, and eyes that held no warmth or mercy. And they ruled their empire through fear and violence, and the absolute belief that strength was the only thing that mattered in the universe to them. The Velith were less than animals, useful only for the labor they could provide and the profit they could generate. Ambassador Salith stood on the balcony of the great hall and watched the sky darken with ships, her limbs pulsing a dim and hopeless blue that matched the sadness in her heart. It was harvest day again every cycle. The Cathari came to take 10,000 of her people away to work in their mines and factories and pleasure houses across the empire. And every cycle, the Velith could do nothing but watch and grieve. Selith was old now, nearly 200 years by her people's counting, and she had seen more harvest days than she could remember, each one taking someone she knew. Someone she loved, her own daughter, had been taken 40 years ago, and Salith still dreamed of her light, still remembered the way she had pulsed goodbye as the Cathari soldiers dragged her toward the transport. Ships the memory hurt more than any wound below her. The Velith gathered in the central square, their lights dim and flickering with fear as the first Cathari shuttles began their descent through the clouds. No one ran, because there was nowhere to run. And no one fought, because they had never learned how. And no one screamed, because they had no voices to scream with. This is how it has always been. Salith thought, her light pulsing the ancient phrase of acceptance that her people had repeated for 3,000 years. This is how it will always be. But then something happened that had never happened before. A new light appeared in the sky, small and fast and completely unexpected. And every Velith in the square looked up with confusion, pulsing through their limbs. It was a ship, but not like any ship Salith had ever seen. It was angular and battered and covered in scorch marks, and it moved through the Cathari formation like a stone thrown into a pond, causing chaos wherever it went. The Cathari warships immediately turned their weapons toward this intruder, their commanders shouting demands for identification over every communication channel. And then the strange ship spoke. The voice that came through was rough and broken, speaking in badly pronounced Galactic Common that crackled with static and interference. But every word was clear enough to understand. "We are humanity," the voice said. And there was something in it that made Salith's light pulse brighter without her permission, something that sounded like hope and defiance mixed together. "We heard the silence, and we came to listen." The Cathari commander laughed, his harsh voice booming across all channels as he mocked this tiny ship that dared to interrupt his harvest. "You came to listen to what?" He sneered. "These pathetic creatures cannot even speak. And you are one ship against my entire fleet." So turn around and leave before I destroy you for wasting my time." There was a pause. A moment of silence that seemed to stretch across the entire planet. And then the human voice spoke again. No, just one word. But it carried the weight of something ancient and unbreakable. Something that the Valith had never heard before and did not understand. Cathari Commander's laughter died in his throat. "What did you say to me?" he demanded. His voice suddenly cold and dangerous. "I said no," the human repeated. And now there was something else in that voice. Something that made even Salith feel a chill run through her body. "We will not leave. And you will not take these people. And if you try, you will learn why our home galaxy learned to fear the silence before a human speaks." Salith watched the tiny ship hold its position against the massive Cathari fleet. One vessel against 12. And she felt something she had not felt in decades. She did not have a word for it in her language, because her people had stopped believing in it long ago, but in the human language. She would later learn it was called hope, and hope, she would soon discover, was the most dangerous weapon in the universe. The Cathari commander gave the order to fire, confident that this fool and their broken ship would be dust within seconds. Was wrong, he was so very wrong, and the galaxy would never be the same again. The humans had come to Vetha Prime 18 months ago, and they had come as refugees with nothing but their ships and their grief, and the desperate hope that somewhere, in this vast galaxy, they might find a place to call. Home Earth was gone. Captain Elena Vasquez still saw it, sometimes when she closed her eyes. The blue and green marble that had been her birth world, now nothing but dust and radiation, and memory a dying sun, had taken everything from humanity in a matter of years. And by the time they had built enough ships to escape, only 40,000 people remained from a species that had once numbered in the billions. 7 ships had carried them across the stars. 7 battered vessels held together by hope and engineering miracles. And they had wandered the outer rim for years, begging for sanctuary from every civilization they encountered, but no one wanted them. The Cathari Dominion had laughed at their request and told them to leave or be destroyed. And the Morvith Collective had politely explained that they had no room for primitive species. And the Ilari Confederation had simply ignored their messages entirely. Humanity was too poor, too weak, too unknown to matter to anyone in this cruel galaxy. And Elena had begun to lose hope that her people would ever find a home, and then they had found Vetha. Prime Elena remembered the day they had entered orbit around the beautiful world, their ships running low on fuel and food and everything else that kept people alive. She had sent out the same message she had sent 100 times before, the same desperate plea for help that had been rejected 100 times before. And she had expected the same result, but the Valith had not rejected them. Instead, they had sent a message of their own, a simple pulse of light that the translators had struggled to interpret. "You are tired," the message had said. "Come down and rest. No demands for payment. No questions about what humanity could offer in return. No suspicion or fear or hatred, just kindness." Elena had cried when she read those words. And she was not ashamed to admit it. The Valith had welcomed the human refugees with open arms, sharing their food and their homes and their knowledge freely, asking for nothing in return except friendship. They had taught the human children to read the light language, and the human children had taught the Valith young ones to sing. And for the first time since Earth had died, humanity had found something that felt like peace, but peace never lasted, not in this galaxy. Not for species that were seen as weak. Elena had learned about the harvest days within her first month on Vetha Prime, and the knowledge had filled her with a cold fury that she had hidden behind a calm smile. The Valith accepted their fate, because they had known nothing else for 3,000 years. But Elena could not accept it, would not accept it. And she had quietly begun to plan now. She stood on the bridge of the Endurance, watching 12 Cathari dreadnoughts form a blockade around the planet that had become her home, and she felt that cold fury burning brighter than ever before. "Captain," her first officer Marcus said, his voice tight with fear, "they outnumber us 12 to 1, and their ships are bigger and better armed than anything we have. So maybe we should consider running and coming back with a better plan." Elena did not look at him, her eyes fixed on the Cathari fleet through the main view screen. "The Valeth took us in when no one else would," she said quietly. "They gave us a home when we had none, and they shared their food with our children when we were starving. And you want me to abandon them now that they need our help?" Marcus looked down at the floor, shame coloring his cheeks. "No, Captain," he whispered. "I suppose I do not." Helena opened a communication channel to the Cathari flagship, her voice calm and steady, despite the fear that hammered in her chest. "This world is under humanity's protection," she said. "Leave now, or discover why our home galaxy learned to fear the silence before a human speaks." The Cathari commander's response came immediately, a harsh laugh that echoed through the bridge speakers. "You are one ship against my fleet. Little human, and your species is nothing but refugees that nobody wants. So what exactly do you think you can do to stop me?" Elena smiled. And it was not a nice smile. "You are right that we came here with 7 ships," she said. "But you are wrong about how many we have now." She pressed a button on her command console, and across the planet, hidden beneath the phosphorescent seas and inside the crystalline caves, 43 new vessels powered up their engines and began to rise. Valeth had not asked what the humans were building in their underwater shipyards, trusting their new friends completely. And humanity had worked in secret for 18 months preparing for this day. You see, Elena continued as her hidden fleet emerged into the light of day. "We humans have a saying that your translators might struggle with, but I will try to explain it anyway." She leaned forward in her chair, her eyes blazing. "The saying is this: never mistake kindness for weakness, and never assume that those who choose peace cannot choose war when they must." The Cathari commander's laughter had stopped. "All ships," Elena said, her voice ringing across the communication channels, "protect our home, protect our family, and show these slavers what happens when they threaten the people we love." The space around Vetha Prime exploded into fire and light, and humanity went to war. The battle lasted 11 minutes, and in those 11 minutes, the Cathari learned a truth that would haunt their species for generations to come. They learned that humanity was not weak at all. The Cathari had conquered 1,000 worlds and enslaved 100 species. And they had always won because they were bigger and stronger and more brutal than anyone they faced. They had never faced anything like humanity before the first Cathari dreadnought died without warning, its reactor overloading in a cascade of fire and light. That turned the massive warship into a second sun for a brief and terrible moment. The Cathari commander stared at his tactical display in disbelief, unable to understand what had just happened. "How?" he demanded, his scales turning pale with shock. "How did they do that?" His officers had no answer for him because they did not understand it either. Truth was simple but terrifying. The humans had found a crashed Cathari probe 6 months ago, and instead of reporting it to the Dominion, as they were required to do, they had taken it apart piece by piece and studied every component until they understood exactly how Cathari technology worked. They had learned the shield frequencies that protected Cathari ships, and they had developed weapons specifically designed to bypass those shields. And they had kept this knowledge secret until the moment they needed it most. The second dreadnought fell to a boarding party, small human assault shuttles latching onto its hull like parasites and cutting through the metal with plasma torches that burned hotter than stars. Cathari soldiers inside had expected easy prey, small pink creatures that they could crush with their bare claws. But instead, they found something else entirely. Found humans who fought like demons. Private Sarah Chan was the first through the breach, her rifle blazing and her voice screaming a war cry that her ancestors had used 1,000 years ago on the battlefields of Earth. She was smaller than any Cathari soldier by half, and she was softer and weaker in every physical way. But she was also faster and smarter, and absolutely unwilling to stop fighting until she was dead. A Cathari warrior swung his massive blade at her head, a blow that would have cut her in two. But she ducked under it and fired 3 shots into his chest and was already moving to her next target before his body hit the ground. "For Vetha Prime," she shouted, and her squad echoed the cry as they pushed deeper into this ship. The Cathari did not understand. They had fought many species across the galaxy, and all of them followed the same pattern. They fought until the odds became hopeless, and then they surrendered or retreated to save their own lives. But the humans did not retreat, even when they were outnumbered and outgunned. Even when victory seemed impossible, they kept fighting with a ferocity that defied all logic and reason. It was not courage. Not in the way the Cathari understood courage. It was something else. Something born from a species that had already lost everything and had nothing left to lose. The third dreadnought fell when a human cruiser rammed it at full speed. A suicide attack that should have killed everyone aboard, but the humans had planned for this, welding themselves into reinforced crash pods designed to survive impacts that would destroy any normal ship. And when the cruiser punched through the dreadnought's bridge and came out the other side, the human crew was still alive and already firing at the next target. Captain Marcus Webb laughed as his ship tumbled through space, alarms screaming and hull breaches venting atmosphere into the void. "Damage report," he called out, blood running from a cut on his forehead. "We lost 40% of the hull. Propulsion is offline. Life support is failing. And we have maybe 10 minutes of air left," his engineer reported with a grim smile. "Perfect," Marcus replied. "That is plenty of time to take out one more of these bastards." He aimed his crippled ship at the HFY nearest dreadnought and fired every weapon. He had left the Cathari commander, watched his fleet fall apart, and could not believe what he was seeing. These humans were insane. They did not fight like a species that wanted to survive. They fought like a species that wanted to destroy their enemies, no matter the cost to themselves. "Retreat," he finally ordered, his voice shaking with a fear he had never felt before. All ships retreat immediately, but it was too late for most of his fleet when the battle ended and the last Cathari vessel fled into hyperspace. Only 3 of the original 12 dreadnoughts remained, and they were running as fast as their engines could carry them. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Endurance, surrounded by the wreckage of enemy ships and the bodies of fallen friends, and she allowed herself a moment of grim satisfaction. They had won. But she knew this was only the beginning, because the Cathari Dominion would not accept this defeat, and they would return with a fleet large enough to crush humanity and the Valith both. "Send a message to every species in the Dominion's territory," she ordered. "Tell them what happened here today, and tell them that if they want to be free, now is the time to stand up and fight." The message went out across the stars, carried by 1,000 different channels and networks, spreading like fire through dry grass, and the galaxy began to listen. For the first time in 3,000 years, the conquered peoples of the Dominion began to wonder if maybe, just maybe, they did not have to be slaves anymore, because if one small group of human refugees could defeat a Cathari fleet, then perhaps anything was possible. Perhaps freedom was possible. And that thought was more dangerous than any weapon humanity had ever built. The news spread faster than light itself, carried by smugglers and traders and secret networks that the Cathari Dominion had never been able to destroy, in cantinas and slave quarters and hidden meeting places across 1,000 worlds. People whispered the same story over and over again. The humans stood for the silent ones, And the humans did not run at first. The conquered species did not believe it, because they had learned long ago that hope was a poison that only made the pain of reality worse. But then the proof came. Recordings from the battle that showed human ships ramming Cathari dreadnoughts, showed human soldiers fighting with impossible fury, showed a tiny refugee fleet defeating an armada that should have destroyed them in minutes, and something changed on the mining world of Keth-7. A Morvith worker looked at the Cathari guard, who had beaten him every day for 20 years, and for the first time in his life, he did not look away. "What are you staring at, slave?" the guard snarled. Raising his shock stick, "Nothing," the Morvith replied. But his voice was different now, harder and stronger. "I am staring at nothing at all." He went back to work. But that night he met with other workers in secret, and they began to plan on the pleasure stations of the outer reach. The Ilari servants stopped smiling at their masters, stopped pretending to be happy in their chains, and started remembering that they had once been a proud and free people on the factory worlds and farm colonies and prison, planets that made up the Dominion's vast empire. The spark of rebellion began to grow into a flame. The Cathari Dominion responded the only way they knew how. With overwhelming force, the High Council assembled a war fleet of 200 vessels, the largest armada the Dominion had ever created, and they declared humanity a galactic threat to be exterminated. Admiral Kethfor took command of this fleet, a warrior who had crushed rebellions on a dozen worlds and had never known defeat in his long and bloody career. "We will burn Vetha Prime to ashes," he announced to his commanders. "We will kill every human and every Velith, and we will make their deaths so terrible that no one will ever dare to defy us again." His fleet set course for the human homeworld, confident that victory was assured. But strange things began to happen along the way. The Morvith Collective, which had been subjugated for 800 years, suddenly refused to supply fuel to the war fleet, claiming that their refineries had suffered technical difficulties. The Ilari Confederation, which had been peacefully integrated into the Dominion a millennium ago, accidentally destroyed several navigation beacons that the fleet needed for accurate hyperspace jump supply. Ships disappeared, communication relays failed, and soldiers began to fall ill from contaminated food. Admiral Kethfor raged and threatened and executed officers he suspected of treachery. But he could not stop the sabotage, because it was coming from everywhere at once. A dozen species, scattered across Dominion space, had each decided to do something small, something that alone would mean nothing, but together would slow the war fleet. Just enough, and while the Cathari struggled to reach Vetha Prime, humanity was not sitting idle. Captain Elena Vasquez had sent out a call for allies, not expecting much response. But what she received astonished her. Ships began to arrive at Vetha Prime from across the galaxy. Old freighters and converted cargo haulers, and ancient warships that had been hidden in asteroid fields for centuries. Morvith sent 12 vessels crewed by workers who had never held weapons before, but were eager to learn. The Ilari sent 20 ships captained by people who had spent their whole lives pretending to be loyal servants while secretly dreaming of freedom. Even species that humanity had never heard of arrived, drawn by the story of the humans who had stood against impossible odds and won ambassador. Salith watched the fleet grow day by day, her light pulsing with colors she had not used since she was young hope, and joy and fierce determination blazed through her limbs as she stood before the gathered representatives of 37 species, all of them united for the first time in history. Behind her, Captain Vasquez waited in silence, letting the Velith ambassadors speak for the alliance they had built together. Zalith's light pulsed in the complex patterns of her people's language, and the translators carried her words to every delegate in the chamber. "For 3,000 years, my people have been silent," she said. "We have accepted our fate because we believed we had no choice. We believed we were weak. We believed that peace meant submission. Her light flared brighter, but we were wrong. Not about peace, but about what it means to be strong. Because strength is not just the ability to fight. It is the ability to stand up for what is right, even when you are afraid. And for 3,000 years, we have been too afraid to stand. She turned to look at Elena, her light softening with gratitude. The humans showed us that we do not have to be afraid anymore. They showed us that even the smallest voice can shake the galaxy if it speaks the truth. And they showed us that we were never voiceless at all. Salith faced the delegates again, her entire body blazing with light. We simply had no one worth speaking to, she declared. Until now, until we found friends who were willing to listen. Friends who were willing to fight for us. Friends who reminded us who we truly are. The chamber erupted in cheers and lights and sounds from a dozen different species. All of them united in purpose for the first time in living memory, and in the darkness of space. The HFY War fleet finally completed its journey and emerged from hyperspace above Vetha Prime, ready to crush this rebellion once and for. All Admiral Kethver looked at his tactical display and felt his confidence waver for the first time in his career, because the humans were not alone anymore, and the fleet that waited for him was larger than anything he had expected to find. Admiral Kethver stared at the fleet arrayed against him and felt something he had never felt before. In his long career of conquest and destruction, he felt doubt his war fleet of 200 vessels had seemed unstoppable when they left Dominion space, a force so overwhelming that victory was certain. But now he saw an armada that matched his own in size and exceeded it in something else entirely. He saw hope. The Allied fleet was a patchwork of different ships from different species, held together by nothing more than shared purpose and desperate courage. And by every tactical doctrine, Kethver knew. It should have been easy to defeat, but at the center of the formation, broadcasting on all frequencies, sat the Endurance and the 42, human vessels that surrounded it like a protective wall of steel, and Fury Admiral Kethver opened a communication channel, his voice dripping with the contempt that had served him well in 100 conquests. "You protect the silent ones," he sneered. "Those pathetic and spineless creatures who cannot even speak, who have been slaves for 3,000 years, because they are too weak to be anything else. And you think this rabble of freed slaves can stand against the might of the Dominion?" Captain Elena Vasquez smiled. And it was the same smile she had worn when she destroyed his predecessor's fleet. "You are right," she said calmly. "The Valith are silent and peaceful, and they never learned to fight, and they never wanted to hurt anyone." Her smile faded, replaced by something cold and hard and absolutely terrifying. "That is why they have us." Admiral Kethver gave the order to attack, and the largest battle in galactic history began. The sky above Vetha Prime burned with weapons fire as 200 HFY warships clashed with the Allied fleet, and the Valith below watched with their lights pulsing in fear and hope and desperate prayer. It was not an easy victory. The HFY were experienced warriors who had conquered worlds for centuries, and they fought with all the fury of a species that knew their empire would fall if they lost this battle. Human ships were torn apart by HFY weapons, their crews dying in fire and vacuum, but never retreating, never surrendering, fighting until the last possible moment. Morith freighters rammed HFY cruisers, their pilots singing ancient songs of freedom as they sacrificed themselves for the Causilari. Warriors boarded enemy vessels and fought hand-to-hand in bloody corridors, showing their former masters that servants could become soldiers when given the chance. The battle raged for hours, and the cost was terrible. Elena watched friends die on her tactical display, saw ships she had known since the exodus from Earth explode into debris, felt every loss like a wound to her own heart, but she did not stop fighting. And neither did anyone else, The turning point came when a group of Valith vessels entered the battle, ships that had been hidden for millennia. Relics from an age before the first conquest, when the Silent Ones had still been free. They did not carry weapons, because the Valith had never believed in weapons. But they carried something else instead. Massive communication arrays that could broadcast. Across every frequency at once Ambassador Salith stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, her light blazing so bright that it hurt to look at her. And she sent a message that every ship in the battle received simultaneously. "You call us weak because we choose peace," she said. Her light words translated into 1,000 languages. "You call us silent because we do not scream. You call us cowardly because we do not fight. But you are wrong about all of these things." Her light shifted to colors that the Valith had not used in 3,000 years. Colors of defiance and courage and righteous anger. "We are not weak. We simply value life more than you do. We are not silent. We simply wait for words that matter, and we are not cowardly. We simply know that true strength is not about what you can destroy." She turned to face the Cathare flagship directly. Her light focused into a beam of pure brilliance. True strength is about what you protect. And we protect each other, all of us, every species in this fleet. Because we have learned something that your empire never understood. The allied fleet surged forward as one. Inspired by her words, fighting with renewed fury. We have learned that we are stronger together than we ever were apart. And we have learned that even the smallest voice can shake the galaxy. And we have learned that hope is not a weakness, but a weapon. Admiral Keth watched his fleet crumble around him and knew that he had lost. Not because humanity was stronger, or the allied fleet was larger, but because his soldiers had stopped believing that victory was possible. While the enemy still believed they could win, the last Cathari dreadnought fled into hyperspace 3 hours later, leaving behind the wreckage of an empire and the birth of something. New Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Endurance, surrounded by exhausted officers and the weight of everything they had lost, but also by the joy of everything they had saved. Ambassador Salith appeared on her view screen, her light pulsing with gratitude and love and something that needed no translation. "Thank you," she said simply. Elena shook her head, tears running down her cheeks. "You saved us first," she replied. "All those months ago when we had nothing and no one, you gave us a home. So this is just us returning the favor." In the years that followed, the galaxy changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Cathari Dominion collapsed as species after species declared independence. And in its place rose a new alliance built on the simple principle that every voice mattered, even the silent ones. Humanity spread across the stars, no longer refugees but protectors, welcomed everywhere as the species that had reminded the galaxy what courage truly meant. And on Vetha Prime, human children played with Valith young ones, learning to speak in light while teaching their friends to sing. Two species bound together by something stronger than blood or borders. A young Cathari diplomat visited the planet many years later, seeking to understand why his people had lost so completely. Why did humanity risk everything for a species that could not even say thank you aloud? He asked an elderly human veteran who sat beside a Valith elder. The old soldier looked at his friend, watched her light pulse soft and warm with affection, and shrugged. "They did not need to say it," he replied. "We heard them anyway." He smiled and took the Valith elder's hand in his own. "That is the thing about silence," he said softly. "It is only empty if nobody is listening. And we humans have always been pretty good at listening to those the galaxy ignores." The Cathari diplomat nodded slowly, finally understanding the silent ones had never truly been weak. They had simply been waiting for someone who was willing to hear them, and humanity had heard them, and that had changed everything far above. The stars continued to shine on a galaxy that was finally truly free And somewhere in the light between worlds, the voices of 1,000 species sang together in a harmony that had never existed before. It was not silence anymore. It was music.